Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. It's Wednesday, September 11th, 2024, and today we're going to be answering 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators over the past 7 days. And as we do each week on the Roundup, we take our questions that we answer here on Wednesdays from our newsletter that comes out on Monday mornings. And there are 2 versions of that newsletter that you can get a hold of. One is available through subscription on our website, free subscription at smieconsulting.org/subscribe. And the other version is through LinkedIn. I'll share both links to this week's edition as well as the link to our website where you can subscribe if you prefer an email version, and if you prefer the LinkedIn version to get your international education news, you can get that as well. I'll drop the link to this week's edition of the LinkedIn version in the chat as well. And between the 2 versions of the newsletter, we now have well over 2,000 subscribers who are getting their international ed news each week from SMIE Consulting. So thank you so much for making us a part of your international edification, for those who are subscribed. And for those who are joining us here on Wednesdays for the Roundup, glad you're a part of the community as well. I encourage you to be a part of the conversation. If you have questions, please let me know, and I'll get those answered live. If not, I know most folks are watching this on repeat because it's a busy day for all of us Wednesdays, and we're just trying to fit this into your schedule wherever you can. Thanks for watching on repeat for those who are taking the opportunity to do that on Facebook, LinkedIn, or YouTube. We also have an audio-only version of the Roundup available on all the major podcast providers, and we now have well over 3,700 downloads of the podcast. So we're very excited about how the Roundup is also becoming a regular part of international educators' weekly practices. So let's get right into our first question of the day, and that is one that's near and dear to my heart, and that is, are our websites meeting international student needs? And ever since websites have become a thing in the early noughties, and certainly into the mid-noughties when we started to see websites that had much more dynamic content, had much more robust capabilities in terms of linking to forums and all sorts of other bells and whistles, video content, all of that, social media linkages, and all of these things that have been added in over the years. I've always focused, when I was back on the institutional side in the mid-noughties at Ball State University, we did sessions all the time at regional NAFSAs and the national NAFSAs on putting your best web foot forward and what that looked like and what the content on your websites needed to have for international audiences. And over time, those same principles have remained true in terms of the kinds of things that you need to have, but the formats of those have changed, and how often students are using or accessing our websites, not just in that prospect to initial enrolled student stage, but throughout their journeys on your campuses. There are multiple purposes for your site and multiple reasons for your international students to come back throughout their time on your campuses. And the questions are always asked is, are we really meeting our needs for our students at all different points in the spectrum? Are we mixing up our content throughout the year for our international audiences, for our student audiences, either before they get on campus or while they're on the university campus? So those are the kinds of questions that I think have the evolution of how our websites are meeting student needs is changing. And some institutions are still quite stuck in the past and don't see institutional websites as student-facing primarily or almost exclusively, that they have these grand mission statements that don't really appeal to future students that much, that they tend to be more business-focused, alumni-focused, perhaps athletics-focused, not on future student-focused. So there's still many students that are in that phase, or many institutions that are still in that phase of reconfiguring their sites to become more student-centric. And that's certainly something we've been doing at UNLV. We're in the process of a web upgrade for our admissions sites to make them much more student-centric, obviously, and that from the top down in terms of the architecture of our institutional website. But particularly the content pieces for international students, we're fighting a good fight to get those properly elevated and recognized, and as few clicks as possible from the homepage, all the kinds of things that you need to have. But one of the focuses of our website, and all websites frankly, needs to be on how searchable it is. The content on your site is searchable for the different needs that students have. So are students moving away from multiple clicks to get to things and 1 or 2 clicks to get to things, and are they searching for things in the first place? And is your search capabilities on your site truly reflective of where your future students and current students, frankly, need to get their information in terms of what they're looking for? So those are the kinds of questions to ask. And the article that we're referencing to in this regard is one from our friends at ISIF Monitor that asked the question, university websites, how can we make them better for international student recruitment? And there's some great content in here, and I really encourage you all, if you're not already subscribed to the ISIF Monitor, you can do so for free on their website, and I've dropped the link to the current article, and it has a big subscribe for free button on there that you can take advantage of. But there are so many important pieces in here, talking about SEO, talking about the student journey, kind of the, not an overused word, but certainly one that makes, one that we embrace certainly at UNLV. It's been part of our internationalization journey over the last 3.5 years, is talking about the journey of international students from initial prospect through all the way through, not just to enrolled student, but to becoming graduates and then successful alums of our institution, is that focus not just in the international office, but throughout the campus, and from web to housing to food service to career services to libraries to advising to alumni offices, all the way through their student journey. The embrace of what international students are, the differences that they have that we need to be sensitive to in terms of legal requirements, in terms of what they can and can't do. All of this has been part of our education process for our international students. And that is an education process for what we hope to provide them, but also an education process for our institutional partners on campus in the various offices that impact student life, that they are aware of these differences. And part of the education process is identifying where some of the gaps might be in providing services for our future students. And as they go through our enrollment process, but also our current student process, that we need to make sure we have services that cater to them. So website is certainly no exception to that rule, and that is probably the most important part in making sure that your future students, when they come to your site, are getting the kinds of content, getting the kinds of tools and information they need to apply and decide to apply, and find out all the necessary pieces they need about the scholarships that are available, about the I-20 costs that they're going to need to show that they have funding for, all the way through to enrollment. So all of that needs to be very prominent on your websites, and if it's not, then that's a potential area that can inhibit future students from making their way to you and finishing their applications. And if it's too hard to find basic information, they may not even apply. So those are the vast majority of visitors to institutional sites that bounce within a minute or two without finding the content that they need. There's a reason for that, and the reason is that you aren't making everything readily apparent to your intended audiences. And that's obviously something that needs to be adjusted for in any evaluation of how websites are performing in reaching their intended audiences. But let's talk about some of these other tools that universities have been also trying to leverage in recent years. The international edtech space has gotten very crowded up over the last decade. You've seen a lot of entrants onto the scene that have promised the world and underdelivered quite incredibly, and have left huge peaks and valleys in terms of the expectations and poor unmet expectations of these new services in providing the kind of silver bullet to solve enrollment woes that help bridge that gap from future student to enrolled student, and making that process much more seamless, much more engaging, much more progressive and in tune with your institutional mission in terms of responsiveness, in terms of all the different pieces that you might put into play. There's an upcoming webinar next week on this topic that may be worth checking out. It's also by our friends in ICEF, September 12th at 10 a.m. Eastern, described as from marketing to admissions to enrollment and anything in between. Increasingly sophisticated digital tools are available at every step of the international student recruitment process, funnel and beyond. They provide revolutionary opportunities to improve efficiency, increase quality, create more transparency, and reduce costs and time. And it doesn't end there. Artificial intelligence is now making it possible to automate different stages in the recruitment process in part or in full. This raises a number of important questions. So the questions will be answered in the webinar. So definitely something worth checking out if you're at all concerned about how you're doing on the digital front in terms of making sure your site and the tools associated with your website to reach your future students, whether they're hitting the mark or are certainly missing their targets. You'll find out how others are dealing with some of these very similar questions. So if you haven't already registered for that, I'd certainly encourage you to do so, as that should be a webinar actually tomorrow. Today's the 11th, right? So that's tomorrow, Thursday, September 12th. So certainly one to watch if you don't have anything better to do at 10 a.m. Eastern tomorrow. It will be one that I know I'm signed up for and will probably be seeing. So that's the first question of the day. Let's move on to question 2, which is what is holding an explosion of international students from coming to the United States? This is one that, if you've been looking at some of the surveys that have been sent out recently, some of the predictions, not surveys necessarily, but some of the data reports that have been sent out, some of the predictive analysis that some organizations like Barnard and IIE have done in conjunction with other partners in terms of overall global growth in international student enrollments, mobility of international students, and what some of the key destinations will be in the future beyond just the top 4. You've seen regional hubs developing in Asia, and you've seen other countries that have had declining have increasingly elderly populations, declining youth populations, ramping up their international student recruitment efforts to bring students in. I spent time earlier this year in Nepal, last month in Nepal for a few days, and getting to know the landscape there a little bit better. There are 700 agencies out of about 3,200 in Nepal that are just recruiting for Japan. Japan is recruiting heavily in Nepal because in Japan they have a declining domestic population of college-bound students, so that country is needing to fill skills gaps that they're anticipating having in the coming months and years with some of these international student populations. So 700 agents in Nepal recruiting just for Japan. So that is happening globally. So in the United States, for example, as we look at this question, we've seen some of the big players, IIE, Barnard, have expressed a very positive outlook about U.S. International student numbers in the coming decade, with IIE saying that the numbers could double to well over 2 million in the next 10 years. Barnard says that well over 1.8 million will be enrolled, or about 1.1 as of the last Open Doors report. So they're predicting a 700,000 student increase in the next 10 years. IIE predicting doubling that to well over 2 million. So is that possible? And that's the real question here, and what is holding that back potentially, the explosion that's coming. Why is an explosion coming? We're seeing some of that play out now with the cap that was introduced earlier this year for Canada, what's happened in the UK with the dependent study ban, what's happening now in Australia with a 240,000 or 270,000 cap on new international students this next year in 2025. So, and the impact that's going to have financially and reputationally on all these Australian institutions, Canadian institutions, which are actually Canadian institutions reporting 45% drops in new international students this year, well beyond the 30% cap that the government had introduced. So these other countries are hitting hard times. Will they always be that way? No, they'll rebound eventually, hopefully, for their sakes. But the U.S. is relatively unfettered in terms of our continued growth. Our policies have remained largely the same. There have been some tweaks here and there to make it easier on the visa side to get visas. If you've already had a U.S. visa in the last 5 years, you don't have to go for the in-person interview, all of that. And that's really one of the gets to the real sticking point. What's really holding back? What's the potential that the U.S. has for substantial growth? We touched on it a little bit in recent roundups where we mentioned an article that our friends at INTED had put out in their reflections on the EdUSA forum, and how the visa issues and the visa delays in some of the key markets are still significant. And I was just in Nepal, and they've got a 365-day wait for student visa appointments now. Of course, they opened a lot of appointments late for late August, early September, and that was and probably the most selective institutions that might have still had appointments or school start dates later in September. But anyway, so the point has been that the challenge is with the physical need for interviews. For students who have never been to the United States, who have to go for an in-person interview, which is 95% of visa applicants, I think, these days, the challenge is getting an appointment in a lot of countries, and particularly in the high-demand countries like India and Vietnam, Nepal. You see that as well. So what is that challenge? The challenge is staffing of consular officers in consulates and embassies to do the visa interviews. There is a finite supply of those because we have that requirement for international students who have not yet had that visa to the U.S. in the last 5 years have to go for this in-person interview. That UK doesn't, Canada doesn't, Australia doesn't. Our major competitors farm out the processing of the application paperwork, which can, in Canada's case, take up to 6 months. But that is a significant delay that they have. But our delays are that may be manageable in terms of the third parties that are doing the processing. That's more manageable than having the physical bodies in place to do X number of interviews every day. We've talked before about how the ones that the U.S. Foreign Service folks that are doing the interviews are typically in their first or second rotation of their work in embassies and consulates as part of their Foreign Service careers. Their first or second appointments, 2 to 3 years at a time, the majority of their days are spent doing those visa interviews, not just students, but all sorts of visa applicants. So those folks coming out are typically from the elite, from foreign service schools, or from the elite of universities in the United States that want to pursue careers in U.S. Foreign Service. And they typically have a limited scope of experience with schools outside those elite institutions. So their knowledge of community colleges and other low-cost alternatives institutions, public and regional institutions that might be good fits for some students, they poo-poo, and that does happen. They will say it doesn't, but the training, as much training as they have, the biases that each consular officer brings to the table just reflect through in a lot of the visa denials or 218Bs or 214B denials that get put out there in terms of they're not a serious student. They don't have a good plan, which may or may not be true depending on the student. So a lot of reasons why students don't get visas, and there's been increases in India in the past year, a lot of increases in visa denials that our partner agencies in India have suggested is happening. And whether that's, we haven't necessarily seen that so much for us at UNLV, but we are seeing that from other partners, expressing a decline in new international students or new students from India this year. So the challenge is there is limited capacity for physical number of visa slots that officers can do each day, because there's only a certain number of them each that are available to do these interviews. And whether that's in India, whether that's in China, Vietnam, Nepal, Thailand, wherever it might be, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico. All of these countries have the challenges of staffing on the U.S. consular officer side. And the reason for that is because we don't produce enough, and budgetarily all of these positions have to be approved in congressional budgets for new staff in the State Department, how they determine their budgets and such, and their approvals for that. So we don't have enough capacity of visa officers, consular officers, to meet the demand of student visa applicants. They're moving heaven and earth in certain countries like India to try and improve that situation. They're going to be opening 2 new consulates in the next 3 years in India to help adjust, to accommodate for that increased demand. But there's still going to be, in other countries, maybe not as much motivation to increase the number of consular officers that can do these appointments. So we hamstring ourselves in the U.S. by requiring the visa interview for all students who have not previously had a visa to the United States. So the article that I've shared in the chat is from Times Higher Ed, and it's called "Bumpy Road Ahead for U.S. Universities Recruiting Overseas." And I don't really get the tone of the title because it doesn't reflect the actual content of the article so much, because it does talk about so that the other countries that are restricting are opening the door for more U.S. Students, but they do point specifically in terms of the bumpy part, is perhaps what the focus of our question is today, is that the visas are the ones, the visa is the most cumbersome process, part of the process for them, and in terms of getting the appointment. Even though it is, the State Department has allowed students to apply for their visas 360 days in advance, a year in advance of their start dates. The challenge is, the reality is, institutions typically aren't issuing I-20s that far in advance. Certainly none that I know of, unless there's a deferral for, say, an Iranian applicant for this fall. We've already told them don't expect to be able to get in this fall if they only get their I-20 in May or June. We tell them let's plan on fall of 26 or fall of 25 if they were looking at this fall, but we can't issue that new I-20 until later on, maybe around this time, for them to come to get their visa interviews in before the start of the following fall academic year. So a lot of challenges in there, and it really comes down to more consular officers not being available to do the interviews that are required to meet the demand. So that's the bumpy road I see as the biggest challenge ahead for the U.S. as a destination to reach the heights of what some of the predicted models are showing we could get to in the next decade. So we'll see how this all peters out or turns around and gets even stronger in the next few years. So that's the question number 2. The final question we'll talk about today is really kind of a quick survey of what's happening in Australia, Canada, and the UK. And we've talked about this before in terms of the impact of government decisions to restrict enrollments in Canada's case and in Australia's case. There have been a number of articles on Australia this past week that's saying that there's going to be a stall in the economy because of what's happened with this restriction of only 270,000 new internationals allowed in 2025. There's predictions of significant decreases in funding or in GDP for the country as a result, where we're looking at multiple billions of Australian dollars being lost in terms of revenue for institutions because of this. So we'll see how this will all shake out. So the articles are reflecting that kind of negative tone in Australia at this point in terms of what the expectations are. Certainly losses of revenue for institutions. We're seeing in Canada that they are going to be, they're actually, as we talked about earlier, the cap reduction of 30% was achieved, more than achieved, and in fact they're now down 45% in terms of new enrollments this fall, as opposed to the minus 30% that the government had initially wanted. So that's something that Australia has to look forward to. There may be a cap of only 270,000 that the government has approved for new internationals for 2025. Let's see if they get there. That's going to be a real question. If you're looking at what Canada's just done, they put a 30% cap in place, and they had a lot of exemptions to this, which you'd think would have favored some of the master's degree programs on up, but haven't. They're 45% down. And now Australia is saying we're cutting to 270,000 maximum in 2025. If they get 250, I think they'll be lucky. 270 might be the maximum the government's going to allow, but they might not even get that. Certainly, if you use the Canada example, they might be lucky if they hit 200,000. So that's something well worth watching for the coming year in Australia as to how well they'll do. And you see what's happening there in Australia and what's happening in Canada. You also have what's happening in the United Kingdom, that the recent numbers are showing 20% or so down in terms of reduced international student numbers. And HEPI, Higher Education Policy Institute in the UK, has put out what the anticipated losses will be. If there is a 60,000 student drop in the coming year, in the coming academic year that is just beginning, it would reduce, of 60,000 students, it would reduce university income by 1.4 billion pounds, and reduce accommodation income and other revenue streams that result from students coming to campus. That could be well in excess of 2 billion pounds or more, and is in EPI's well-established opinion that the losses could push many vulnerable institutions in the UK financially to the brink of ruin. So the consequences are significant, and whether they see the longer-term impacts in terms of staffing, in terms of universities folding altogether because of their overdependence on international students, there's a lot that is up in the air in terms of what expectations are going to be in the UK for students. But it's not looking good for any of the other three major destinations besides the US. We'll see what the SEVIS by the numbers reports in October reveal for total international student numbers leading up to International Education Week. Obviously, the Open Doors number are going to be a reflection of the previous year's international student numbers, so not as directly relevant to what's actually happening this fall right now as we speak, as institutions are starting back up. There's going to be a snapshot survey that IIE will do as part of Open Doors in November 24, but the real hard and fast numbers of real-time data for international students in the U.S. will come when SEVIS by the numbers reveals their report for hopefully October or early November. So lots of possibilities, positives coming down the road for the U.S., and we'll see what the fall numbers reveal from SEVIS by the numbers. But for UK, Canada, and Australia, it's going to be some tough times in the months ahead. So I wish all of my colleagues in those countries all the very best. Our thoughts are with you. That's all we have for you this week on the Midweek Roundup. Join us again next Wednesday, September 18th, as we'll take a dive into 3 more questions that our international ed colleagues are asking of their news colleagues in the media, and we look forward to covering all of that with you next week. So until then, have a wonderful day. Cheers.